Prisons in the United States of America house many of the world's most dangerous and notorious prisoners. One of those is Edward Johnson.
He was brutally beaten beyond recognition.
The guy, from pretty much the moment he entered the facility, was a loose cannon.
He seems to be a complete psychopath by the very definition of psychopathy.
Johnson is a cold, calculating killer who brutally murdered a female friend.
She was in the bathtub, and he had stabbed her to death. He had no remorse whatsoever, and he was just proud. Didn't care. We were all sobbing, and he just thought it was funny.
Even securely locked behind bars, Johnson's violence continued.
Mr. Johnson is institutionalized just by the fact that he's been incarcerated essentially his whole adult life, and he continued to reoffend.
The thing that makes maximum security prisons more dangerous is that the inmates, they've already made it up their minds that they're going to live and die in prison.
And Mr. Johnson was in a fight with another inmate here at the prison and lost his eye.
Edward Johnson is a danger to all staff that are in his immediate area and his fellow offenders as well.
Surrounded by dangerous prisoners, it is often the prison guards who become targets.
He brutally killed a correctional officer in Minnesota by bashing his head in with a hammer.
Edward, I think he's the devil. I do.
Minnesota Correctional Facility, Stillwater, the largest male prison in the state.
We're standing outside the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Stillwater. It's a prison that was built in 1914. It houses about 1,600 inmates.
You could have guys in there that have life sentences for murder, rape, assault, all kinds of theft crimes, extortion. Any kind of felony you can think of on the books has guys like that at the facility. Serial murderers are there.
When it does kick off, they go all the way. They'll attempt to kill you.
So as you're walking down the hall in the middle of it, you have prisoners on this side, 3 or 4 levels high. It's a scary place to visit.
Edward Johnson is notorious within the prison as one of the most dangerous prisoners.
Edward Johnson is a very dangerous criminal who has a lengthy history of violence. He's very cunning and manipulative. He has a lack of empathy, a lack of remorse. All of those personality traits point to a high level of psychopathy.
Behind bars, Johnson continued the violent behavior that put him there.
He was the kind of inmates that even other inmates stayed away from because of his behavior. They referred to him as somewhat of a wacko and someone they had wanted nothing to do with because he was potential dynamite ready to go off.
I would say Johnson is probably one of the most dangerous prisoners to exist in the United States, absolutely.
Edward Johnson was born in Chicago in the 1970s into a middle-class family.
He was the son of 2 cops, Edward and Selena Johnson, who both worked for the Chicago Police Department.
Johnson and his younger sister had a difficult upbringing.
There was domestic violence between his parents, who by all accounts were generally good members of society, although his father struggled with alcohol abuse.
The mother had tried, from what I understand, to leave his father many times and had not been successful in that.
Johnson's mother filed for divorce in June 1988 and kept custody of the children.
She was scared and knew that at some point he might kill her.
On the 13th of September 1988, Johnson's father broke into the house and attacked his estranged wife.
The kids were home at the time, and Edward heard a commotion, went out, and saw his father beating his mother. The father then tried to push him out of the room, but then he could hear shots.
Mr. Johnson actually witnessed it, and he described his mother's head bouncing when she was shot multiple times.
After the shooting, the father left the scene and the kids went to a neighbor's house to report the shooting. They later found Edward Johnson Sr. dead in a motel room of suicide. He shot himself in the head.
"12-year-old Edward Johnson and his sister moved to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they were raised by an aunt.
So when it comes to Mr. Johnson, we really don't know what were the predisposing factors to help him become this psychopathic, violent criminal. However, the witnessing as a young child of his father murdering his mother, that had to be extremely traumatic. And it also painted a narrative in his head that these are how relationships with females are supposed to occur. This was normal.
By the time Edward Johnson was 26 years old, he had accumulated a couple of assault charges, a drug possession conviction, and had been in prison several times. In 2002, while free, he ran into his friend, 22-year-old Brooke Thompson.
My name is Lori Thompson, and I'm the mother of Brooke Thompson. I was told by her friends that she met him through one of her past boyfriends who was related to him. He was his cousin, so she knew him as a friend while she was dating his cousin.
In July, Brooke asked Edward to help her leave her boyfriend.
She was in an abusive relationship. She needed to move out, and that's when Edward said, "You can crash with me for a little while, until you find another place of your own." He said she could crash on his couch while she was looking for another apartment.
Brooke and her 5-year-old daughter temporarily moved into Johnson's apartment in the Minneapolis suburb of Bloomington.
Brooke wanted to become a paralegal. She had a great job working at a law firm in downtown Minneapolis, and she was going to school part-time 2 nights a week to be a paralegal. She was raising her daughter, Taylor, and Taylor, she was the light of her life.
Unbeknownst to her mother, Lori, Johnson started getting obsessed with Brooke and acting possessive.
She had told her friends, "He's being kind of creepy, and he's acting like my boyfriend, and he's not my boyfriend, and he wants to know where I am all the time."
Brooke became frightened as Johnson became more threatening.
There were signs that something was wrong with this guy, and that's right around the time she was getting ready to leave.
Johnson decided he wanted to take Brooke to Chicago with him, but she refused. He took the rejection badly and threatened to take her against her will.
It doesn't seem like there's anything he will not do to get his needs met. Nothing is a consequence for him.
On August 13th, 2002, Brooke planned her escape and asked her mother to look after her daughter for the night. But first, she wanted to pick up some belongings at Johnson's.
She said, "I need you to watch Taylor tonight for me. I have to work in the morning." And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love to take her." So we waited and waited and waited, and she never showed up that night. I was very worried, but I thought, well, she must have slept in, went to bed early. I didn't know.
The next morning, when one of Brooke's friends phoned Lori, asking for Brooke, they both realized something was wrong.
I called her work, her office, and they said she was not in and had not called in. And that's when Edward reached out to her, to Brooke's friend, and said, Brooke had to leave and would like me to drop off Taylor with you. So can you meet me?
Brooke's friend agreed to meet Edward outside a grocery store. Lori joined them, but she also brought with her undercover police.
We were inside the grocery store watching for him, and she saw him pull up, so she walked out there, just as friendly as she could be, made small talk, got Taylor out of the car, and walked her into the grocery store.
The police immediately took Edward Johnson into custody and started an investigation.
The police transported us to the Plymouth Police Department and just brought us into a meeting room and asked us just to sit tight while they were still looking for Brooke. So we waited there for several hours, knowing nothing. All we could think of was he must have beat her up. They came in and got me and said, we need to speak with you privately, and took me into a separate room and told me they found her. And I just said, oh God, is she okay? What's wrong? What happened? And that's when they told me she's gone. He killed her.
He ended up stabbing her multiple times.
Every parent's worst nightmare.
Edward Johnson had killed Brooke Thompson in his apartment.
Taylor was in the next room watching TV. She heard the whole thing. She said he kept hitting Mommy's head against the bathroom door, and she kept screaming, please stop, please stop.
It was a horrible, horrible death, but what makes it even more tragic is Brooke's daughter, Taylor, who was 5 at the time, was home and heard her mother screaming.
She was in the bathtub, and he had stabbed her to death. So they found her.
After being charged with the murder of Brooke, Edward Johnson was imprisoned to await trial.
Edward Johnson was arrested in 2002 for the murder of his roommate. He was housed in the Hennepin County Jail in Minneapolis.
When a person commits a crime out on the streets, they get arrested, they go to the police department to get processed, and then they'll go to county jail. That's where they'll take away their belongings, dress them out in inmate attire, fingerprint them, book them, and they wait there until they get scheduled to go to prison.
While there, he punched a deputy in the eye after he was told that he couldn't visit a certain part of the jail. And I think it just sort of speaks to the violent behavior that Mr. Johnson has.
On February 13th, 2003, Edward Johnson appeared in court to face second-degree murder charges.
Edward, I think he's the devil, I do. Through the whole murder trial in the courtroom, he turned around and he was smiling and smirking and winking at us. He had no remorse whatsoever, and he was just proud. Didn't care. We were all sobbing, and he just thought it was funny. That's a psychopath. The only person that showed up to support him in court was his sister. And she actually wasn't there to support him. She was there to support us. She came over and spoke with me and apologized on his behalf and hugged me and said just how terrible she felt that he had done that.
Edward Johnson was offered and accepted a plea bargain. He was sentenced to 29 years for second-degree intentional homicide.
We were furious. We were not consulted about that. I said, he took a life. He should be in there for life. I don't understand.
Edward Johnson was sent to Minnesota Correctional Facility, Stillwater, to serve his sentence.
The Stillwater is kind of the focal point of the Minnesota Department of Corrections. It's been historically been the most problematic in terms of the severity of incidents which occur.
It's an old prison. It looks like a prison that you might see in the movies. You would see the bars. You walk through and you can see the prisoners at the bars and the clanging of the bars.
You know, we're talking about a dangerous environment where I mean, you've got individuals who have perpetually sometimes committed violent acts against their peers, their neighbors, their families, corrections staff, police officers.
This is where Edward Johnson was sent in 2003, after he was sentenced to 29 years in prison for the murder of Brooke Thompson. He was not a model prisoner. He spent a lot of his time while he was here in the segregation unit, over 1,700 days, which is really quite a high number for an inmate.
My name is Shane Warkey. I'm a corrections sergeant with the Minnesota Department of Corrections. I've been in corrections since 2005. The Stillwater facility at its peak was housing a lot of offenders. I think up into the 1,620 offenders.
You'll have guys that will be in there for 5 years, and you'll have guys that will be in there for life. There is conflict between gangs. You'll have skinheads, for example, white gangs, and then gangs of color, black gangs, Hispanic gangs, that type of thing. And inmates assaulting each other are common.
Edward Johnson was no different. While inside, he continued his violent behavior.
In 2004, he was involved in an incident at the prison where another inmate stabbed him in his right eye.
Ironically, Edward Johnson tried to attack another offender with a shank. That offender got a hold of Edward Johnson's weapon and returned fire, so to speak, and ended up stabbing him in the eye, which he ultimately lost his eye.
Having lost an eye as the result of a fight with an inmate, whether or not he was responsible for starting it was completely irrelevant. This was going to fuel more anger in Mr. Johnson, fuel more rage, and justify to him that further acts of violence were necessary, because this is all he knows.
And there was just this hatred by Edward Johnson. He had just a great disdain for the people that he deemed to be responsible for the loss of his eye. I would say that the general consensus was, and it wasn't just all staff, it was one particular staff who he felt was responsible because the gate was accidentally open when in turn he was the one that gate opened or closed, took a weapon and went and assaulted another offender. So I think it just goes to illustrate kind of his way of thinking, which is absolutely irrational.
Edward Johnson had a lot of anger against the prison and against correctional officers after that incident where he lost the vision in his eye.
Very early on, Johnson probably had this mixed idea about authority. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they supposed to serve and protect? His father, who was a police officer, murdered his mother.
An inmate might want to attack a guard for numerous reasons. They could feel disrespected, they can be angered, they could be enraged, having a psychotic episode, and just have total disregard for life. And they don't really need a reason.
He had articulated that he was going to get revenge for the loss of his eye, often.
Having lost an eye within the first year of being incarcerated, Johnson's record did not improve. He was constantly in trouble.
When I look at his discipline record, Edward Johnson doesn't look like he was somebody that was trying to improve his life.
His criminal activities within the prison system, which involves assaults, threats, weapons, disobeying orders, being in an unauthorized area.
See possession of tobacco and alcohol too, so he was probably using substances throughout his incarceration as well, adding more fuel to the fire.
Edward Johnson had a growing desire for revenge. Prison staff believed he was a danger to everyone in Stillwater and should be transferred to a higher security facility.
Some of the threats in prison for correctional officers and for the inmates is threat of being violently attacked. You can get stabbed, you can get slashed with a slashing weapon, you can get what's called gassed, where they will throw some type of substance on you, whether it's urine, feces, blood, and they attempt to get you in the face, or just jumped by 100 or 200 individuals in a riot or staff assault.
When an inmate was labeled a problem person who really was a loose cannon, a significant risk to other inmates or COs, they would be transferred to the Oak Park Heights facility, which is a facility that has closer scrutiny of inmates.
Rather than being transferred, Johnson was put to work inside the prison with the hope of rehabilitation.
The industry program at the Stillwater facility, it's just like you'd walk into an industrial complex. They've got a wood shop where they can make wood products too, office furniture, upholstery.
If an inmate has a history of disciplinary issues, especially threats exacted against prison personnel, they should not be in industry, ever. They had access to tools like hammers, sharp tools, the kind of tools that you would expect, like, in a mechanic's shop or in an industry facility where they make products.
You're talking about potentially people with violent histories that are in possession and using tools that can inflict great bodily harm or death.
Why is this guy out in an environment where he can have access to these weapons and the opportunity to use them? It makes no sense. None at all.
Johnson had been looking for an opportunity for revenge, and he found one.
This inmate had been planning the attack. In fact, sent letters to his family telling him much the same, that he was going to assault somebody. You'll be reading about it soon.
Johnson went in for the kill.
He murdered him with a hammer. He attacked him from the back and bludgeoned him to death.
Edward Johnson was at Minnesota Correctional Facility, Stillwater.
Stillwater prison has got a Gothic kind of Victorian look.
It's the image most people have of a prison with the bars and open cell blocks.
They're behind these metal bars, and you can often hear them yelling or catcalling as you're walking through, or banging on the metal bars.
There had been lots of assaults that have occurred over the years, and vicious assaults on staff. I mean, I'm talking people have been hospitalized and had to retire early or never came back to work. Multiple offenders fighting, that kind of amplifies the situation.
I talked with many different union officials who represent the correctional officers in Minnesota. One of the things that they stressed was there aren't enough correctional officers working staffing the prison.
The ratio from offenders to guards is unsafe across the agency. I mean, you might have 4 corrections staff in a unit of over 200 offenders. You do the math on that, and the odds are not stacked in your favor if they were to choose to do things a certain way.
By 2018, Edward Johnson had spent almost 1,700 days in segregation, but was allowed to join the industry program to learn new skills.
With the record that Johnson had in prison, the time he spent in segregation, which is the jail within the prison, in other words, he's not turning his life around. He's not changing his behavior. He doesn't deserve to be out in industry. That industry should be reserved for those inmates that are proving that they want to change their lifestyle, change their choices, and become a productive citizen.
There's really not what I consider to be a solid vetting process for determining who is the best candidates for these positions.
The prison officers working at Stillwater were very aware of the potential problems in industry and the prison as a whole. One correctional officer, Joseph Gom, ensured new recruits understood the situation.
I remember when I first met Joe Gom, I was probably within the first few weeks of my career in corrections back in 2005. And I was, just like any other rookie, scared, you hear all these stories, stay away from this person's cool.
Joe was a kind of officer that would be respected by inmates, staff, and the public. He did his job. He did his job appropriately and respectfully. He was the kind of officer that if there was something that the inmate requested and he could do it and it was within the guidelines of the SOP, he would do it. Where others may not. They might say, I don't have time to deal with you. Joe would take care of that.
Throughout his career, he bounced around to different places throughout the facility, working in like the education unit where the offenders go to school, and then as well as out into the industry area too. He was just always that guy that you could go to, but he also wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right.
He was very concerned about himself and his fellow employees, and he had actually said, and I quote, "It's going to take one of us to die before there's any significant change."
Since losing his eye, Edward Johnson had been searching for an opportunity to get revenge, and he found one.
On July 18, 2018, and I was working that day. I cover the Minnesota Correctional Facility. Correctional Officer Gom was working there that day. He was in the industry building.
Edward Johnson was also in industry that day. Still blaming the prison system and guards for the events which left him blind in one eye, he targeted Officer Gom.
Edward Johnson, he just carried himself in a different way. He was like quiet, kind of almost like in a Pink Panther sneaky kind of way. And it just always kind of gave me goosebumps a little bit just because the way he carried himself.
Mr. Johnson came up behind him and really unprovoked, just started smashed him in the head with a hammer.
Joseph Gom, he was alone. There were no other COs there. And Johnson got access to him and then proceeded to bludgeon him to death with a hammer. And then he stabbed him to death with a tool that he had made in industry.
I knew something bad had happened, but I wasn't exactly sure what that was. Within probably a half hour of that, some administrators started kind of pouring into my office like they normally would on any other day, because we just kind of talk and joke around. But there was just like a different look about them. A lot of them were looking at the floor, and I knew something didn't feel right. Well, one of them, God bless his soul, pulled me out of the room and told me what had happened.
Other inmates did try to step in, but by the time they got in there, this was very quick, you see. He was killed quickly, and then he fled and barricaded himself in a room.
The officers that responded, first they had to get through the barricade, and one officer stated that he didn't recognize Joe.
I think I found out that it was Johnson that murdered Joe. It was like a few hours after, when everything started hitting the media. I've known who Johnson was my entire career up until that point, so I definitely recognized him. I knew the name and everything like that.
It was shocking. This was national news. This was the first time in the state of Minnesota that a correctional officer had been killed by an inmate. So it was just unheard of. I mean, it was just very upsetting and very disturbing.
Shortly after the attack, Johnson was charged and later pleaded guilty to the murder of Joseph Gom.
I don't think I need to tell you that when Joe died, he was all alone. Something MnCorp staff knew, and something the criminal who killed Joe knew also.
According to the 2018 investigation file, an inmate told investigators that Gom should not have been left alone in the prison's mental shop with dozens of prisoners. Officer Gom had only a radio, pepper spray, and handcuffs when Johnson attacked him.
He's a coward. He attacks from behind. He attacks the weaker. And very difficult to talk about. I, like many other people, would like to go toe-to-toe with that man, put it that way.
There should never be a staff that's by themselves in a shop with inmates with potential weapons. That to me is a no-brainer.
As far as Edward Johnson was concerned, he had taken out his revenge.
On the exact day that Joe was murdered was the 14-year anniversary of the date that this man had been assaulted by another inmate and lost the vision in his right eye. It wasn't just a coincidence that the day that he killed Joe, it seems clear that this man had a vendetta.
After a turbulent 16 years in prison for the murder of Brooke Thompson, 42-year-old Edward Mohammed Johnson had been planning to attack prison staff.
Why was Joe the target? When, there's staff that are not liked by inmates. Why not one of them? Well, then you come to realize inmates are opportunists. They take an opportunity of the situation, and Joe was in that situation. He was in that uniform. That made him the target.
There was no evidence that Joe Gomm had any issues with Johnson. Nothing, zero, no evidence whatsoever.
When you think about psychopaths and people who engage in this high-level violence, they don't have what we call consequential thinking. They typically engage in what serves them in the moment. So if Johnson wanted to kill that officer, if he was angry, if this is the only way he knows how to deal with emotions, he was going to deal with those emotions by murdering.
The family and friends of Officer Gomm were devastated.
Anyone you've talked to about Correctional Officer Gomm will tell you what a kind soul he was. And I'm not sure you would hear that about every correctional officer, but certainly in this case, it just makes it incredibly heartbreaking.
I was mad, as well as grieving. I was really mad. I still am. Still am mad. Should have never happened.
In 2018, immediately after murdering prison officer Joe Gomm, Edward Johnson was finally transferred to high-security prison, Oak Park Heights.
So in the case of Edward Johnson utilizing a hammer to brutally murder a correctional officer, that's fairly rare because inmates that have access to those type of weaponry, whether it's a hammer behind the work change wall or knives inside of a culinary kitchen, the inmates in there are usually privileged to be working in that area, so they don't want to mess up their opportunities.
When an inmate was labeled a problem person who really was a loose cannon, they would be transferred to the Oak Park Heights facility.
Oak Park Heights facility, which is our Supermax facility, which when it was built was to mirror the Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado.
The Oak Park Heights prison, which is just about 5 miles from the Stillwater prison, is a very different experience. When you are there, it's very quiet. Each inmate has their own cell, and the cells they're big metal steel doors that slide and slide into place. So it's a very different experience as from visiting the Stillwater prison.
Edward Johnson had committed the worst possible crime in prison, murdering an officer. Now, all the officers feared for their lives.
We always knew that there was a possibility that any one of us could be killed in the line of duty, but it was never like on the forefront of our thinking. I was in complete shock, kind of a little bit of denial at first until it started kind of hitting the waves on the media, and it was like, a reality. And yeah, it's still hard to believe that it happened.
Officer Gomm was the first correctional officer killed in the state of Minnesota. Most of the staff that worked with him and most of the staff throughout the department were infuriated because it could have been prevented. The reports that officers had written for concerns of the safety in that environment that Joe was killed in were not considered.
Well, the governor was very responsive, and it was obvious he felt terrible about what happened. The commissioner for the DOC was responsive also. Their own agency went after him really hard. But the DOC fought that, claiming in essence that they didn't do anything wrong.
After Joe Gom was murdered, the prison went into lockdown. I believe it was 3 weeks. Yeah, that was definitely one of the most struggling times when the offender population was locked down and some of the things that we had to listen to them saying. And there were some offenders that were legitimately like upset about it too, which at that point in time, I found it pretty, I guess I never looked at them as having empathy, but I think I've seen some empathy after that, even from the offender population. There were other guys that would sit there and yell stuff at us from their cells. We call them cell warriors. The guys that are way up on a tier off to the side and they're yelling stuff at you and, you know, you guys should learn from your friend and this can happen again and things like that they would say. So we were working in that.
On July 26, 2018, a funeral was held for Joe Gom.
Thousands of correctional officers and dignitaries came in from all over the United States and Canada to be there present. It was a moving ceremony.
Joe Gom's funeral was like nothing that I had ever seen. It was full police honors. So, 21 gun salute. There were agencies from around the country that came. It was a media spectacle. There were helicopters flying over the cemetery. There was just a lot going on. It was a lot to process. Our chaplain from the facility officiated his service. So there was just kind of a lot of emotion with just seeing how shattered everybody was. And just the outpouring of support that the agency and the people in the agency and his family and everybody received. It was just completely overwhelming.
Joe was not married at the time. He had a girlfriend in Chicago, but the state really had some really nice ceremonies for his death. I remember being at one where they handed his mother a flag, which was really poignant. The family took it really hard, especially when they found out the circumstances and learned about the history of this guy and that his death easily could have been prevented.
In 2018, before Johnson went to trial for the murder of Officer Gom, a hearing was held.
I covered Johnson's first appearance in court at the Washington County District Courthouse in Stillwater. It was a few weeks after the murder occurred. He appeared behind bulletproof glass. He was flanked on both sides by deputies from the Washington County Sheriff's Office. He normally wears an eye patch to cover his eye because he's missing an eye, but he did not wear his eye patch that day and just stared directly into the public gallery area, basically, throughout the entire proceedings. And it just was unsettling.
This guy's a major league criminal. He's a psychopath. He's probably a misogynist, a narcissist, I mean, this guy has the whole gamut.
I would say that Edward Johnson had a look about him. Something that I remember even from when I was brand new, and I think part of it was the fact that he didn't have an eye. One of his eyes were missing, so he was always kind of distinguishable in that respect. But he just had a certain pose about him and the way that he carried himself. He just had this look to him like I've never seen with anybody else before.
Dozens of friends of Gom's and correctional officers attended all of the court hearings through the months after, and they all wore matching T-shirts that said, Joseph Gom, 7/18/18, end of watch. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. It was just incredibly moving.
After Joe Gom was murdered, I designed a T-shirt design, which is the state of Minnesota with a silver line through it, and then some scripture on the back of it. And I kind of collaborated with a local t-shirt design company in the Twin Cities, and they agreed to give a percentage of the proceeds raised to his family, and I think we raised $35,000.
Johnson was charged with first-degree murder of a correctional officer and first-degree premeditated murder. He was indicted by a grand jury in August of 2018.
While he awaited trial, Johnson continued to be held in Oak Park Heights.
The murder happened in 2018, but the case actually wasn't slated to go to trial until 2020. And in fact, toward the end of 2020, there was a lot of legal wrangling on both sides. It sometimes just does take that long to go to trial in Minnesota. But in this case, right before he was to go to trial, Mr. Johnson decided to plead guilty.
When Johnson killed Officer Gaume, he was just 4 years short of being released on parole. But now, he would remain securely behind bars.
We're so incredibly sad for that family. My heart breaks for them too. They went through what we went through. He was not a changed man for the better, that's for sure. I am absolutely relieved he'll never be out. World's a safer place with him behind bars. That's for sure.
He would be a really bad threat to society if he ended up back. There's no question in my mind he would reoffend and kill somebody, sure. No question, especially a woman.
I will never, ever, ever forgive him. I will never forgive Edward. She was a vibrant, beautiful, wonderful person with a kind heart, and he took her away from us. And he took her away from her daughter.
In October 2020, Johnson was given a sentence of life in prison without parole and was transferred to a supermax federal prison in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies.
Joe's sisters attended every hearing. They never missed a one. They had to take time off work and make arrangements, but they would never, ever miss one of the court hearings. They were right there. And every hearing was emotional. You know, to bring it all up again and then to still, it took a long time before there was finally justice served. So it was a very, very difficult period for the family.
I feel like Joe's been pushed under the rug. Everybody's sorry for what happened. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And for us, we're still fighting for justice for Joe. He was brutally beaten beyond recognition. And for somebody to finally admit that somebody didn't do their job and it cost Joe to lose his life.
After Mr. Johnson was convicted of murdering this innocent correctional officer, he ended up being transferred to a supermax prison. The reason that's interesting is because supermax prisons really house the absolutely most dangerous inmates in the country. And so it just points to how Mr. Johnson was not somebody who was just going to engage in crimes in the community. He displayed that he was not only going to engage in crimes in prison, but odds are that even after he was convicted of murdering the correction officer, he was going to continue to engage in crimes, which required him to be housed in a supermax prison. There was no other option.
I heard he was at Florence, and that's it. That kind of turned the page on that whole thing once he was sentenced and he was out of here. What I've read and seen over the years, Florence is kind of about the epitome of supermax prisons within the United States.
He'll be in prison the rest of his life. And he'll always be a threat, wherever he's at. To whoever has interaction with him, whether it be the nurse, the minister, the staff, visitors, he'll always be a threat.